February is Black History Month. As we celebrate and commemorate the history of Black people in this country, we are finding ourselves defending it. Recently, we have found the telling of our story under vicious attack. From the arrival of Africans in chains in North America in 1619, all the way to modern times, Black history is being whitewashed, recharacterized, even denied by those who are not comfortable with the stories that helped build America. Good evening. Welcome to our monthly special edition of the Daily Drum, a collaboration between 96.3 WHUR, HUR Voices, and WHUT TV. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight, we present Black history, more than stories in a book. This evening, you will hear from experts who are living in this very important space today. As always, we have a great panel of experts to lead us through this topic. My guests are Dr. Greg Carr, professor in the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University, Glynette Byram Scott, author of The Day I Marched with Martin, A Day to Remember, and Pastor Michelle C. Thomas, president of the Loudoun County, Virginia branch of the NAACP. Thank you all for joining the conversation. I appreciate you spending some time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Carr, I want to start with you. Are you surprised about the attacks against Black history that we're seeing in schools, in the workplace, even in the public square? Dare I mention the bomb threats against Black institutions, HBCUs, for example?
Oh, well, I'd be surprised, Harold, if there weren't any attacks or threats. There's never been a time in the history of this settler state we call the United States when there haven't been attacks, not only on Black people and Black bodies, but Black memory. Certainly that begins, as you say, with first Africans to come here who didn't come with the English in 1619, but who actually came with the Spanish before and immediately rebelled. Suppressing that memory has been part of the foundation of this country. You don't want people to remember, because when they remember, that proves that they have a past, that they have a culture, that they are human. And then that undermines whiteness, because whiteness isn't human either. Whiteness allows people to think somehow they're better than other people. So no, I'm not surprised. Carter Woodson wouldn't be surprised either, because when he started what we now call Black History Month as Negro History Week in 1926, he did that to talk about not just, as he said, Negro history, but the Negro in history. He says, once you include us, it forces everybody else to have a conversation with us, which will improve everybody. But if you're insecure and if you think somehow the color of your skin makes you better than somebody, well, you never want that conversation to happen. So no, I'd be surprised if there weren't threats.
Pastor Thomas, of course, you represent the Loudoun County NAACP, and you've seen the pushback in the schools and, as I mentioned, the public square about Black history. Now, some people are complaining that details make their children feel bad or guilty. What about Black children who may feel equally as bad because of the pushback?
Sure. It is the lack of details that make our children feel bad. It is the lack of substance. It is the whitewashing of history. It is the lack of respect of our ancestors when they come in and they only refer to them or to our ancestors as slaves. Listen, slavery is an institution. There is not one person, living or dead, in the U.S. who was ever a slave. Slavery is an institution. You can't be WHUR, right? You're not a radio station. We are human beings. We were human when they human trafficked us across the diaspora and brought us to America and enslaved us. So to not use adequate language or affirming language that affirms our humanity, to say that we were enslaved versus slavery, those things, that little detail is offensive to us. And it matters to our children.
Ms. Scott, when you think about, where we are today in this difficult space and reflect on your memories of the civil rights movement, what comes to mind?
The fact that I really think that Black history is being attacked. As you've already stated, the truth is being downplayed, the truth is being denied, the truth is being prohibited. And without knowing our past, we cannot move into a future. I heard a pastor say yesterday that when the past is denied, we will only go backwards into the future, and we cannot allow that to happen.
Talk to me about your experience, as your book title suggests, walking with Dr. King. You were 11 years old. For a lot of people, remembering what happened to them at 11 years is difficult. I know it would be for me, but for you, I would imagine, yes, that was a watershed moment in your life. Talk to me about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, as a young child, my father had always told us about Martin Luther King. Of course, we'd seen him on TV, heard him on the radio. And when the opportunity arose for him to come to Boston, my father decided that he would definitely go. And he decided he would take my sister and I along with him. That event, when it was happening, I was really excited about it. Of course, like I said, I heard Martin Luther King on the radio. I'd seen him on television. And I was really excited about this whole experience. So to have an opportunity to actually march with this man that I had actually seen and heard, and I was just elated. The thing is, when I first began telling the story to the students I worked with, I'm a retired speech and language pathologist, and I would tell the story about how I marched with Martin Luther King around his birthday every year. And when I saw the interest that it sparked in these kids to me, it seemed like history was coming alive to them. And it was at that point that instead of just telling the story, I would actually write it out and read it. And that's what I began doing. And now it's a book. So I think that experience that I had has been able to come alive for children who, of course, they didn't know Martin Luther King, but they knew now someone who had actually marched with him.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Carr, I do want to go back to looking at specifically, where we are right now. We could certainly argue at one point that, things were getting, better when you talk about, race relations, Black history, and how it's being taught. We've got this magnificent African-American museum on the National Mall here in Washington, D.C. And yet, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it just appears to me that in some senses, we are going backward, not forward, even as so much more detailed information is coming out in pop culture about the journey of Black people in this country.
Yes, Harold. Well, I think our fundamental challenge is how we think of time and space. Because whether we're making progress, and of course we have to define who we is. Are we talking about Black people in the United States? Are we talking about humanity globally? Are we talking about people who call themselves Americans? So how we measure progress really is a matter of where we're standing in time and space, and where do we start? As the historian John Henrik Clarke used to say, if you start your history in slavery, everything since then looks like progress. The fact that the four of us are in a conversation here at a Black institution streaming across multiple Black-owned platforms is evidence of progress. Now, at the same time, if you start your history with the origins of humanity, then it becomes much more complex, because we don't know what would have happened if we had been uninterrupted by enslavement and colonialism in Africa. We don't know what kind of contributions we would have made to human history had not those perpetual traumas and the afterlives of those traumas in the form of Jim Crow and apartheid had gone on. But I think the answer is both. We have made incredible progress, and we see the changing same. The things we're seeing today, as I said before, are not new. Carter G. Woodson, who started Black History Month, who framed it in the second week of February because it was the birthday of Frederick Douglass, which incidentally Douglass claimed as Valentine's Day, and Abraham Lincoln. He is continuing in a tradition of resistance that we see that begins when the first person put their hands on one of us in Africa and we were forced to the boats. So, we have to look at progress relative to what our objectives are and where we are starting in time and space. So I think that the simple answer, and which is also the complex answer, is we both made progress, and we both face conflict. We face problems and oppression that remain challenges for us to face and resolve.
Pastor Thomas, what's missing in Loudoun County right now when it comes to Black history? education?
What's missing is the actual Black narrative. What's missing is the use of local history, Black history, to sort of tell the story and put the story in the hands of both teachers and also students. That's what's missing. Right now, we're at a confluence. We're literally at a crossroads in Virginia, where we've had this for the last 2 years. We've had this push. I'll be honest with you. Since our governor and attorney general have been caught with blackface, they have had to come face to face with their lack of education about history. What we have found, the NAACP and also the Loudon Freedom Center, we, in working with the governor and working with the AG, we began to really look at this history book to see, was blackface ever included in the history book? And we found that to be an overwhelming no. And so because the governor Northam had started this African American History Commission, who then spun out an African American history course, which is in the Loudoun County Public Schools, we're in a great space for children to learn, yet we are now at this crossroads for where this course may be taken away from them because of this new administration and their goals. And so we are at the crossroad of the Red Scare, McCarthyism, and the best of times in education of African American history.
I wanted to make sure we understood you were talking about the former governor and blackface. Not the current governor, Glenn Youngkin.
Sure, Governor Northam and Attorney General Mark Herron, both of them were riddled with issues of blackface in 2019.
Yeah, to that point,
yes,
let's take that highly publicized lesson.
Yes.
At least that's one that I would argue people of color would see. Well, that's a, I told you so. And we covered this issue in the news, but do you think that lesson for Virginians have fallen on deaf ears? I mean, it was an "I told you so" moment. Okay, now it's over, and now we are here in this space where once again, it seems that for the majority of the population, other than speaking to the choir, that Black history is still falling on deaf ears for those of us, outside of the community.
I don't think so at all. The Attorney General is actually, Attorney General Mark Herron is actually a member of my branch. I am his branch president. And so as he found himself in this quandary and we began to talk and trying to decode, I know Mark Herron is not a racist. I know that the Governor Northam is not a racist. But why and where did they go so wrong? We were able to track that thing back to their education in Virginia. And it led me to really start to look at the history books. And if I'm telling you, if they went to school in the 70s and graduated high school in the 70s, and still they had no opportunity to learn about blackface, they had no opportunity to really learn about the Jim Crow movement. And still today in 2022, the books are not really detailed about that. And some of the books just whitewash it and move over it. We are at a critical time. No, it hasn't fallen on deaf ears because Governor Northam created this commission explicitly for the purposes of filling in that gap, knowing the books were not right. And so we had to design a curriculum and a course that would address African American history in its accuracy and truth. And he did it. And it's up and running. In Loudoun County, they're teaching that course in at least 10 schools. That's fantastic. We're going to push it forward so it could be taught in every public school here, but it's great progress, but it's up in the air.
Gwinnett, so, the pastor just mentioned something to me and it kind of struck me. Again, you were 11 years old when you had this experience. How did your experience with Dr. King change not only your education, but your perspective about Black history at the time? How did it change you?
Well, at the time, actually, I did not realize that history was being made. And again, this was in 1965. And when he was actually shot and killed in 1968, that's when I really began to realize the significance of the event that I had attended, and that the experiences that I was having out of Black history. And I think it changed me because it made me realize that all of these events that were happening to us as a people at the time were significant for the future of not just of the people in Boston, but for the nation. So I began to, I was a junior high school student. Now they call it middle school. But I was really beginning to realize and understand the significance of our history, and to preserve that history, and to make sure that that history was passed down from one generation to the next generation.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Carr, I did want to go back to this unfortunate situation regarding these bomb threats against HBCUs. There have been, over the past several weeks, more than a dozen, whether they are copycats, just annoyances, disruptions. What do you believe is truly the significance of it, and how should we, our Black community, view these threats?
Well, I think we can't we can't become distracted. The source of these things is very clear. It's white supremacy. It's white nationalism. And I'm not talking about the easily recognizable white nationalism, whether it be blackface, whether it be Klan hoods, whether it be January 6, 2021 at the United States Capitol. I'm talking about a mindset that allows anti-Blackness to become the norm. So when we talk in response to these bomb threats, when we see statements that say we will be resilient, we will, figure this out, we'll endure, and then says, we'll find the people who did it. That's really not what we should be focusing on. We should be focused on a mindset where Black people are not considered human. And that's not just the United States, that's globally. That is a result of the modern world system. And so listening to, listening to Pastor Michelle, you talk about this course in Virginia, for example. We designed the African-American history course that is now required in Philadelphia. It's mandatory for all Philadelphia high school students to take. We understand that step allows young people, their teachers and communities to begin to understand that we share a common humanity, mm-hmm. and that the diversity of humanity here in the United States and beyond is our strength. And that scares the hell out of people who have built a whole identity on that not being true. So these bomb threats, whether they are actual or just people playing around and pranking, they are built on a foundation of a country that says Black life is not human life. And so it's normal. It's normal to attack it. It's normal to laugh at it. It's normal to employ it to make billions in a Super Bowl and have it come on at the halftime show and dance around. But as Frederick Douglass quoted finally in his What to the Slave is the 4th of July, they that carried us off captive required of us a song. As long as we singing and dancing, America loves it. But the minute we push back, there's a problem for those who say, no, we have a place for you in this society. And if you stray from it, we've got a problem. And I think that's really the source of these bomb threats. It's anti-Black racism is what it is.
When you talk about Black history education, one of the things that really struck me, this was several years ago, when I was sitting down with my daughter, Maya. Dr. Carr, you know her well. She was in your class.
My student. Thanks for
right.
Come to Howard, brother. HBCUs all day.
That's right. And she did graduate. So
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Praise God.
No question.
She did it in 4 years. Yes.
She did well. Let them know, Fish. She didn't just skate by. She did well. No question.
Yeah, better than her father. But when she was in high school, and the movie, 12 Years a Slave came out, and we were sitting and we were watching the movie, she turned to me and she said, Dad, it's just like in the book. I did not read that book when I was in high school or Gwinnett Junior High School. That's what it was back then, you know. And so I was glad that she read the book and that she was getting the intensity of a Black history education, even at that young age, even outside of what I was going to give her, what her mother was going to give her, what her grandparents were going to give her, all of whom HBCU educated. And so but this goes back to the very heart of the issue again, Dr. Carr, about this fight that we are seeing right now about the realities, and this isn't about slavery, but we're just talking about the challenges and the difficulties and the mountain climbing of Black history being taught in school.
That's true. That's true. I mean, you said it, Pastor Thomas, local history is the foundation for all these national and world histories that we talk about. When I think about Virginia, for example, I think of Barbara Johns and the walkout they had at Robert Russell Moulton High School in Prince Edward County. Think about all the struggles there. When I think of when I think of your daughter, Hara, I think about somebody who has inherited from two streams. One is the classroom, and that's where we're having our spite. We got to get these classes, and then we have to teach them, and we have to then build assessments, all that work. But we also think about the other stream, which is the first stream, which is the family. We have to have the momentum of memory. So when you talk about yourself, Maya's mother, you talk about the family before them, the grandparents, that is the momentum of victories. That is the momentum of memory of success. And without that grounding in community history, all of our struggles in the schools and to change policy, they don't resonate as well, because what we have to understand finally is that we all make history every day. So when we hear what's going on, Glenette, as you talk about what you in the street with Dr. King, young people need to hear that, not just in Boston. They need to hear it in DC. They need to hear it everywhere. And then they look at you and say, oh, this isn't abstract. No, you are touching history and you are making history. That momentum of memory, that's how we win. That's how we build momentum.
I did want to ask before we take a bit of a break, I did want your perspectives about this really critical question. And I'll start with you, Glenette. Where do you believe we are right now in the fight to preserve Black history?
I believe we are actually in one of the biggest fights, I believe, in my generation that I have seen. The fact that Black history itself past was omitted, and now we see situations where we know what the truth is about our history, and the truth of our history is being denied to tell that story. And if that story is not told, if we are not able to give the truth of our history, we will be in a situation, again, where we will be going backwards into the future. We have people that, if you don't know, don't have a memory of the segregation of Jim Crow, you won't understand why it's important. And I think this is where I heard a passage. You won't understand why it's important to have an office, or in your office, while you have the diversity training for people. So if we don't have that past, people won't understand where we need to go in the future. So it's imperative at this time in our history, we are in a fight that I believe is of great magnitude, and we got to hold up against it, and we got to keep going. We have to keep pushing and keep pushing.
Pastor Michelle, same question. Where do you believe we are when it comes to the fight to preserve Black history?
Preserving Black history is actually one of the greatest civil rights issues of our time. One of the greatest civil rights issues of our time. Why? Because it actually addresses the issue of not only past, present, but future as it relates to systemic racism, systemic injustice, and institutionalized racism. And so all the things that we want to fix, whether it is voting rights, whether it is any type of right, housing right, pay gap right, whatever issue that we're trying to fix today that is related to African Americans, it is going to be steeped in our history. And we will be able to find and decode that there is a line that connects the past to the present injustices. That is why it's so important to have our books banned and bomb our institutions of learning. Why? Because if we don't learn our past, we won't understand the connection or the connectivity to our future. And so we're in a fight that we cannot give up, that we cannot abdicate for others, that, allyship is fantastic, but we cannot expect that others would understand the fight as intimately as we do.
Real quick before I go to Dr. Carr, Pastor Michelle, how would you define your Black history education as a young student?
How would I define my Black history?
Yeah, when high school, junior high school, middle school.
I grew up in Atlanta.
Okay.
I grew up in Atlanta to Jamaican immigrants.
Okay.
I don't have a history with Black. I don't have a problem with Black history. Black history was something that was taught and taught with great pride. The makers of history during that time, the Coretta Scott King, kept her children in public schools. They went to school. Bernice, Martin III, Yolanda, all of those guys went to school. Dexter, they all went to Frederick Douglass High School, which was the same high school that Jamaican immigrants went to, my brothers and older brothers and sisters. Julian Bond, Andrew Young, Maynard Jackson, they all had their kids in local schools. So we had the benefit of having them as parents that would come in and share their experiences of the civil rights movement. That is why, to be honest with you, I'm so good at doing what I'm doing. Okay. I'm so good at activism, advocating, because I cut my teeth on it in Georgia.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, when you told me about your parents and where you were raised, I could have said, well, enough said right there.
Yeah.
Dr. Carr, I'm going to get that question to you in just a bit, but we're first going to take a quick station break. Black History, More Than Stories in a Book, will continue in a few seconds. Thanks for staying with us. Our special edition of the Daily Drum, Black History, More Than Stories in a Book, continues now. I'm Harold Fisher. Just a quick reminder for you, no phone calls tonight, but you can join the conversation online using the hashtag Black History. My guests are Dr. Greg Carr, professor in the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University, Glennette Byram Scott, author of The Day I Marched with Martin, A Day to Remember, and Pastor Michelle C. Thomas, president of the Loudoun County, Virginia branch of the NAACP. Before the break, Dr. Carr was asking the question, where do you believe we are in the fight to preserve Black history? What would you say?
Well, I'd say we have to remember that our history is global. It's not just where we come out of our mother's wombs, that country, those places. It's also the connection between Black people globally. I grew up in Tennessee, so the history that I got came from my communities, my church, my family, and we were in that wave of folk who integrated the schools in Tennessee, and so we didn't get much, if anything, for our Black history in the schools, except occasionally from Black teachers, and that's very important. But listening to Pastor Michelle and listening to Sister Glennette, I'm reminded that Boston is a global city with a heavy Caribbean population, people of African descent. And Atlanta, of course, is a global city as well. And when I think about that convergence that converged there in the schools, as you mentioned, Pastor Michelle, I think about the fact that our people have never made progress anywhere in the world that wasn't aided by us connecting with each other. we're in a moment now where the United States is fracturing. I'm pretty confident within the lifetime perhaps of Maya's children, you're going to see a fracture in the United States that is unprecedented. And that's because we're in a modern world system that is teetering on the bridge of collapse. Capitalism is exhausting itself, and in order to maintain itself, it wants to keep the system as it is. What that means domestically is, in a lot of countries, that means you got to preserve the ruling structure as it exists. In the United States, that means whiteness has to be at the center. And so what you see is a fight to preserve what is people anticipating to be white minority rule. That's what all this stuff is about ultimately. But what we understand is finally that when we know our history and we know we are connected globally, we then work locally to advance our interests. And what that does is that begins to displace that structure that is ultimately harmful to all of us. And that's bigger than Black history in the classroom. That's everything from global warming to extreme inequality and global wealth. You know, those things are tied to knowing yourself, and it's tied to just setting aside the idea that we just all come from the United States and we should start our history with that red, white, and blue flag. We just heard that doesn't work. We have to remember that.
Mm-hmm. Glenn, talk to me a little bit more about, as you kind of reflected back on your experience that you shared in the book. As an adult, was there a seminal moment when you began to really realize, as a full-grown adult, just the significance of your time with Dr. King as a young girl? Was it perhaps the day or perhaps the year, for example, that Dr. King's birthday became a national holiday? Were there other issues that kind of sparked your thoughts about your experience?
Yes. I think as the fact that I actually marched with him, it kind of spurred a determination in me to fight for whatever I could fight for us as a people. I remember I was in high school, and again, it was at a time when Black history was not being taught. And I was part of a walkout in my high school to help the administration understand the seriousness of having an African American studies course. There were situations that I was involved in college as a college student where we had to demonstrate. Again, we were fighting for the right to have African American studies and to make sure that the sociology department at the college I attended did not have certain speakers come, and we had to take a stand. So that experience, I think, kind of sparked a interest or a determination in me to do what I could, and as I was growing up and developing, to make sure that Blacks had the same rights that Martin Luther King was speaking of, to make sure that history was being taught at all levels, from high school to the university institutions, and even now as an adult. I've raised my own children, and one of the things that I did myself is make sure that they had a good background in Black history for themselves. And I see that's being passed on now as my children are teaching their children. One other thing I want to say, I do have a 17-year-old grandson, and I actually spoke to him just yesterday and asked him about what he's learned in terms of his education about Black history and how he felt Black history was being taught in his present high school. He's a senior. And one of the things he said to me is that I really want our history to become part of the mainstream of American history. He said there's some things that, he felt he had been denied learning in American history that he's now learning in an African American studies course that definitely should be part of the mainstream curriculum. So, again, it's what I experienced as a child has gone through me and now to another generation and now to another generation.
How did that conversation with your grandson make you feel?
In a way, I felt like we haven't really made that much progress. I mean, he's almost fighting for the same thing that I walked out for when I was in high school. The fact that he still fighting for what I was fighting for, it just made me feel like, this is a a struggle that's going to go from, generation to generation and generation. And again, we cannot let up, because once you let up, the history is going to be lost, and we will definitely be moving backwards.
So, Dr. Carr, and here we go. So here we go. We've heard a lot of talk about critical race theory, also known as CRT. Can you give us a working definition of what it is, and why does it seem to be so problematic for some people?
Wow. Yes. Critical race theory, and actually, I've been teaching for the last 12, 13 years a class over at Howard Law School, where we engage critical race theory. Critical race theory, simply put, is a body of scholarship, largely legal scholarship, really, began as legal scholarship, that asserts that race impacts every institution in society. Simply put, that's the definition. On the other end of the spectrum, people are using critical race theory, or as you say, CRT, as a weapon to really energize voters, to do things like perhaps win an election for the governorship of Virginia. And so when you ask them, well, what is critical race? What is CRT? They'll say, well, CRT. They don't know anything about it. And actually what they don't realize is in that moment, they are demonstrating a central tenet of critical race theory, which is race operates in this country and in the world as a form of anti-Blackness, meaning you don't have to define it. It's a feeling that's saying my whiteness is being threatened. And so whether it be scholars like Richard Delgado or Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw across the range, you will see the tenets of critical race theory now in every field of study. In law enforcement, for example, critical race theorists would say how police surveil, attack, stop Black people is different than the way they do white people. In education, you would say that the curriculum that we just heard, Sister Gwinnett talk about in Boston, for example, will omit Black voices. In economics, you would say that Black people will not get the same points on a mortgage, or perhaps not even on the same when purchasing a car. And all critical race theory finally is a field of study that says we must now examine how race operates in every institution in society in order to attack and address those inequalities and try to resolve them.
But so to that point, I agree with everything that you said, but why are we only hearing about CRT now? Because critical race theory as a formal intellectual construct is not new. It's been around for decades. So why are we now seeing this issue? Because, racism by any other name is just as bitter.
Yes. Well, simply put, we're hearing it now because it's a useful tool. I mean, it's very interesting listening to you, Sister Gwinnett, talk about, having that conversation with your grandson. You're right. The more things change, the more they stay the same. I'm thinking about a case in 1820 called Roberts versus Boston. The Black people in Boston were like, you've segregated our children and you're not giving them resources. Well, what does Boston do? They then integrate the schools, but then the young people end up in schools that are segregated anyway, and they still have resources. So a generation later, their parents say, wait a minute, we still need resources. The more things change, the more they stay the same. What does that have to do with critical race theory? The letters CRT are the Sharia law of the current election cycle. The Sharia law was the equivalent of calling somebody a communist in the 1960s and 70s, like they did with Martin Luther King. It's not about the definition. It's about what can we use as a wedge issue to maintain power. So we're just hearing about it, frankly, because, and again, I was in my second year of law school when Kimberly Crenshaw wrote the famous law review article defining intersectionality. This is critical race theory is a conversation among academics, and not even all academics, really just academics at the law schools. I know that, having a law degree and teaching at a law school. It became weaponized over the last few months and a year or so because people said, can we seize upon another metaphor for otherness? So CRT, code for Blackness. Sharia law, code for Muslims. Communist, code for they're attacking capitalism and our way of life. Nobody cares about the definition. It's just a hammer you can use to hit somebody over the head and maybe scare up a few more votes so you can stay in power. That's at least the way I look at it.
You know, and Pastor Michelle, from a purely Black history education piece, all of the stuff that we are seeing now that is floating to the top, where we're seeing so much pushback, where people have defined it as CRT. But the thing I do remember from high school, as well as things that I learned at home, it didn't have the title of CRT. It was just Black history, as wonderful and as painful and as difficult and as magical as it was. But it was not, back in the pre-internet days, a political foil.
Mm-hmm. CRT is simply put a tool, a weapon of mass distraction, and a clarion dog whistle. It's a clarion call for anyone who supports whiteness, anyone that supports white privilege, anyone that feels affronted about equity. And the way that we know this is because the argument of CRT did not come around until there was a loss in presidential election. In other words, all the work of Loudoun County to create a more equitable environment, to educate our teachers, as our school district went from a white minority or white majority school district to a minority majority school district. And you have teachers who were just unfamiliar with teaching Black students. You had a level of cultural competence that was detrimental to the psyche and the futures of Black people. And as that began to come to a head in a simple slave game, where teachers were forcing children to pretend as if they were in some sort of slave hunt. Teachers were assigning slave masters, slave catchers, agents, and having kids run around a gym. As that began to bubble up to the front, the CRT people who supposedly live in Loudoun County, they were silent. They only, the result of this resulted in a curriculum change. It resulted in equity training for our children. It resulted in field trips to explore local history for both students and teachers. It resulted in fourth grade curriculum, which is Virginia history, U.S. history, different social science and global studies curriculum changes. It never bothered the CRT people. Only until that election, after the storming of the Capitol, did we see the weaponization of this CRT. CRT is literally a dog whistle. Whether it is a dog whistle that was used by George Wallace, or if it's a dog whistle led by Eon Pryor, it is to disturb white folk. It is to get them, spin and gin up that something is being taken from them. And it is to get them to do fight for your rights to be, superior. And that's what it is. It's unfortunate. It's a ploy. And it's not only a ploy, it is a ploy in one of the worst time of educational history, when our kids are being unfairly and unjustly discriminated against in terms of, disproportionality in their discipline, where Black kids, Black teachers have an issue being hired in Loudoun County. We got some serious issues with Black students not feeling safe in their school environments. And then to add insult to injury, here comes this distraction of CRT, where our transgender students are being attacked daily. But here is this distraction of CRT. It's horrible, but it's not something that we haven't faced in this country before. We faced it before. Just go back to the 60s.
I do want to follow up on something you talked about. You made a reference to cultural competence. We know that there are critics of Black history outside of our community. But are there allies, for example? And if so, who are those allies? Are they politicians? Are they teachers, activists? Who would you count in that number?
We do have allies, and let me be very clear. But our number one ally should be our community. There are people who make history, and there's people who watch history be made. And Black folk need to engage in our history and be our number one ally. And so one of the things that I did personally to be an ally before we bring others into the conversation, let's deal with ourselves, was I became an owner of history. I fought for the right to own a historic African-American burial ground, a slave cemetery. And now I own two. It's been a 6-year journey. I own two. I do historic tours. I do all the training for the Loudoun County Public School teachers so they can teach African-American studies or even Virginia studies in a cultural competent way. We have to be our number one ally. And when people see us fighting for us, it is attractive. They will come on board with what's right. But I'm telling you, yes, we do have some allies of, different races, and you can find them in our NAACP. My NAACP in Loudoun County, we're 70% white. What? Unheard of.
Really?
Because good work attracts good people, and it has nothing to do with race. If you want to ally, do good work. People of all races, ethnic background, they're gonna come.
Okay, so speaking on the allies piece, Dr. Carr, how do we help those allies? For example, let's take white teachers in schools who are trying to but struggling with teaching Black history competently.
Well, I think the question of teaching history competently is one that transcends race. But when we're talking about white teachers, I think, for example, of the work of folk who are local here. In fact, who've had many programs on Howard's campus, including in the studios of WHUT. And that is the Teaching for Change collectives in education. They have it's a robust collection of teachers, mostly K-12 teachers. I'm honored to be part of that collective with them. They have a fantastic Teach Reconstruction campaign that's going on right now. You can look them up. Just look up teachingforchange.org. It comes through collaboration. It comes through modeling. I mean, we just heard Pastor Michelle talk about that. It comes with people talking to people about how to do this work. And if I don't know, I ask somebody. Teachers are very resourceful. They have to be. So the second thing it requires is resources. If you need to know where to start. It isn't just about the textbook, certainly not now in this kind of electronic age we live in now. It's about being able to identify sources of information that are legitimate, that are reliable. And then finally, it's about building partnerships, as we just heard. The Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History, Carter G. Woodson's organization, was founded and grounded in connecting with churches and the Prince Hall Masons and the Order of Eastern Star and all the fraternities and sororities and all the communities, the barbershops, the beauty parlors. Because once folk realize when you come into policymaking that you think you're going to attack this teacher, no, this teacher teaches my child. And so we're all going to show up at the school board meeting until one of us decides who the one's going to be. And then we're going to run for school board and take your seat because it's our seat. That kind of collective work, and it does transcend race, that kind of collective work gets results. And I think that's what we've seen in the past.
So we are just about out of time, but I wanted to get some final thoughts, and I'll start with you, Glennette. You marched then. What would you march for, or do you march for today? What is your issue today?
Well, my issue today isn't really so much as marching. I think the younger generation I'm going to leave that up to them. I'm not as young as I used to be. But I know for myself, my local church, we promoting Black history. And it's not just during Black History Month. The pastor of my church felt that Black history should be a part of the ongoing yearly teaching. And so every Sunday, we have what's called Moments in Black History. And I actually am the one who pulls together the material. I highlight individuals, I highlight events, I highlight things that are happening currently in the city of Boston and our nation that deal with any kind of history for us as a people. So right now, that's my sort of marching, but not actually marching.
Well done. Well done. Dr. Carr, a final thought for you.
Well, again, thank you for doing this work. And I think in doing this work, Harold, what you are modeling for us is the way we have to think about inheriting, the tradition of fighting to tell our stories, to know our stories for next generations. And I echo Glenette. Each generation has to define that for themselves. But what you represent, what HUR, what this platform represents, is how that momentum of memory looks in the current generation. We're not going back to the pre-COVID-19 world. The fact that you're mounting this and we're all sitting in our various locations is evidence of that. This becomes an opportunity for us to now take this thing global. We have to jailbreak the Black University and jailbreak Black history and share it. So thanks again, brother. And that's my final thought as we continue this work.
And Pastor Michelle, I'll let you have the final word.
Thank you so much. Marches never protected people. It literally brought the camera and exposure to our plight and to our situations. What protect people is policy. And what we need to be doing is reaching out to our legislators in Virginia and making sure that we fight against policy that is going to be harmful towards the preservation of African American history. Let me give you some. Policy number 781, policy number 1068. This is HB. Policy 570, 781. All of these policies are divisive and harmful to the preservation of African American history. I told my branch to get their marching shoes ready. I am convinced that we will march as much this year or in the next 4 years in Virginia than we ever did in the 1960s. We shall prepare to march, but we need to protest and protect policy.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for participating in this discussion, sharing your stories and perspectives for tonight's conversation. And I would like to leave you with this. Black history is American history. This imperfect country would not have been built without Black people. The history of Black people in this country is wonderful. It is inspiring and often difficult to listen to. We must all recognize and not run from stories of the original sin of America, that is the enslavement of people of color. But there is so much more. As painful as it is, or may be, for some, we will all be better for knowing our true history. I'm Harold Fisher. Thank you for watching and listening. Good night.
Produced by WHUT and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. For more information on this program or any other program, please visit our website at WHUT.org. Thank you.